It was a chilly autumn evening when Jonathan Hale, a self-made millionaire, returned to his car in the dimly lit parking lot of an upscale restaurant. As he approached his sleek Bentley, he noticed something strange: a small, frail figure curled up in the back seat, fast asleep. She was no older than 10, dressed in ragged clothes, her face smeared with dirt, and her hands clutching a thin blanket. Jonathan's life would never be the same from that moment on. Title: A millionaire found a little beggar sleeping in his luxury car and took her to his mansion. One day, when he got home from work, he couldn't believe what she had done to his disabled wife. Jonathan Hale had everything a man could dream of: fame, fortune, and an empire he built from the ground up. However, beneath his calm exterior, he carried the weight of an immense burden. His wife, Eleanor, once vibrant and full of life, had been paralyzed in a tragic accident 2 years prior. The incident left her unable to move or speak, confined to a wheelchair in their grand mansion, where nurses tended to her around the clock. Their once joyful home had turned into a cold, silent fortress. Jonathan had devoted himself to his work, immersing himself in his company's affairs to escape the pain of watching his wife suffer. He felt helpless, unable to restore what they once had. The mansion that was once filled with laughter was now eerily quiet, save for the occasional murmur of the nurses. That night, when Jonathan found the little beggar girl in his car, he was shocked. Who was she? How had she gotten in? He could have easily called security, shooed her away, or ignored the situation altogether, but something stopped him. The girl, no older than 10, looked fragile, like a bird that had lost its way. Compassion took over, and without a second thought, he gently woke her up. The girl startled awake, her eyes wide with fear as she tried to scramble out of the car. "I'm sorry, mister. I didn't mean to. Please don't hurt me." Jonathan's voice softened. "It's okay. You don't have to be scared. How did you end up here?" She stammered through her words, explaining that her name was Lily, and she had been living on the streets for as long as she could remember. That night, with nowhere to go and the cold biting at her skin, she saw his car parked with the door slightly ajar and snuck in, hoping to find warmth. Jonathan's heart clenched. He had no children of his own, and for some reason, the sight of this lost little girl stirred something deep inside him. Against all reason, he decided to take her home, at least for the night. She couldn't stay on the streets, not in that condition. The next morning, Jonathan arranged for a guest room for Lily and gave her food and new clothes. The mansion, though massive and luxurious, was a lonely place for both him and his wife. Eleanor, despite being paralyzed, had sharp, observant eyes. She watched the little girl with a mixture of curiosity and sadness, perhaps remembering the life they had once hoped for, a life filled with children and laughter. Lily, though initially shy and reserved, slowly began to open up. She was bright, resourceful, and full of questions. Over the weeks that followed, she brought a kind of energy back into the house, a flicker of life that had been absent for far too long. She would run through the halls, helping the staff, asking about the paintings on the walls, and even learning to play chess with Jonathan during his late evenings. Jonathan couldn't help but grow attached to the girl. She reminded him of what he had lost, the dreams of family and happiness that had been shattered by the accident. Lily, in her innocence, filled a void in his heart. She started to visit Eleanor's room often, talking to her, showing her little drawings, and reading her stories, even though Eleanor couldn't respond. Yet, something unspoken lingered in the air, a tension between Jonathan and the new dynamic. He found himself caught between the care he was giving Lily and the guilt he felt toward his wife. Was he replacing the family he had lost with this strange little girl? The guilt gnawed at him, and as the days passed, he tried to distance himself emotionally. But Lily's affection for Eleanor only grew. She would spend hours by her side, talking, laughing, and playing games, even though Eleanor couldn't physically participate. The mansion staff began to notice something odd. Though Eleanor remained motionless, her eyes followed Lily with an intensity that hadn't been there before. It was as if, somehow, the little girl was reaching a part of Eleanor that no one else could. Jonathan, too, began to notice small changes. The nurses mentioned that Eleanor's pulse would quicken whenever Lily was in the room, and one evening, Jonathan swore he saw a single tear fall from Eleanor's eye as Lily read her a bedtime story. One evening, after a long day at work, Jonathan returned home to find the mansion in complete chaos. The staff was in a frenzy, and his heart pounded as he rushed to Eleanor's room, fearing the worst. What he found inside left him speechless. Lily stood by Eleanor's bedside, her small hand clutching Eleanor's, tears streaming down her face. But that wasn't what shocked him. Eleanor, his wife, who had been paralyzed and mute for 2 long years, was moving. Her fingers twitched, her lips parted, and the faintest of sounds escaped her throat. It was a miracle, or at least it seemed like one. Jonathan fell to his knees, overwhelmed with emotion. Eleanor. Her eyes, once blank and distant, were now filled with something, a spark of life, a connection that hadn't been there before. She couldn't speak, not yet, but there was no mistaking the change. Her body was responding, as if Lily had breathed new life into her. But just as quickly as the miracle appeared, doubts crept in. Jonathan's joy was tainted by a rising sense of dread. How was this possible? What had Lily done? Was this some kind of trick? His rational mind couldn't make sense of it, and yet here was his wife, slowly recovering after 2 years of hopelessness. Over the next few days, Eleanor's progress continued, though slow and fragile. She could move her fingers slightly, and her eyes tracked movement more clearly. Jonathan, still in shock, couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He questioned the nurses, consulted doctors, but no one had an explanation. And then, one night, he overheard a conversation between Lily and Eleanor that chilled him to his core. Lily, sitting by Eleanor's side as usual, whispered, "Don't worry, Mrs. Hale. I'll make sure he keeps his promise." Jonathan's heart raced. What promise? He hadn't made any promises to Lily. What was going on? He decided to confront her, to get to the bottom of this strange situation. When he asked Lily about the promise, she looked up at him with innocent eyes, but her words were anything but innocent. "I promised her that I'd help her get better. And she promised me something in return." Jonathan's blood ran cold. "What did she promise you, Lily?" The girl hesitated, her gaze shifting to Eleanor, who lay silently in her bed. "She promised me she'd make sure I'd never be alone again." The weight of Lily's words hung in the air like a dark cloud. Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that something supernatural had occurred, something beyond his control. Eleanor's recovery, though miraculous, seemed tied to this strange girl in ways he couldn't understand. As the days passed, Jonathan became increasingly uneasy. He watched as Lily continued to spend time with Eleanor, almost as if they shared some unspoken bond. Eleanor's movements became more pronounced, but with each step of her recovery, Jonathan felt himself slipping further into a web of confusion and fear. One night, Jonathan couldn't sleep. He wandered the mansion, lost in his thoughts, until he found himself standing outside Eleanor's room. The door was ajar, and inside, he saw something that stopped him in his tracks. Lily was sitting on Eleanor's bed, her small hand resting on Eleanor's chest. And for the first time in 2 years, Eleanor spoke. Her voice was weak, barely more than a whisper, but it was unmistakable. "Thank you," she said, her eyes locked on Lily. "I'll keep my promise." Jonathan stumbled back, his mind reeling. What had his wife promised this girl? What had Lily done to bring about this miraculous recovery? And why did it all feel so wrong? In the end, Jonathan realized that he would never fully understand the bond between Lily and Eleanor. But one thing was clear, Lily had given Eleanor something no doctor or nurse could, hope. And in return, Eleanor had given Lily a place in their lives, a home she had never known. But at what cost? As the seasons changed and the mansion once again filled with warmth and life, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that something had been lost in the process. Eleanor was recovering, but she was not the same woman he had married. And Lily, though still the sweet, innocent girl he had found in his car, now carried a weight far heavier than any child should bear. In the end, Jonathan was left with a question that would haunt him for the rest of his days. Had he saved a little girl, or had she saved them all, at a price none of them fully understood? The end. The day began like any other for Connor Reeves, a successful millionaire businessman with an air of invincibility. Used to getting his way in all situations, he relished his seat in first class, scrolling through emails on his tablet with a glass of champagne by his side. Across the aisle, an elderly woman struggled to fit her oversized handbag into the overhead compartment. To Connor, she was nothing more than an inconvenience in his perfectly curated world. He sighed loudly, annoyed that her presence had disrupted his peace. But little did he know that this woman, who he openly humiliated in front of the entire cabin, would return into his life in a way Connor Reeves had once believed that power and success were all that mattered in life. But after one fateful encounter with an elderly woman on a plane, he learned that true success. Connor Reeves was a man who had built his empire from the ground up. A man who took pride in controlling every aspect of his life, from his business dealings to his personal interactions. He wasn't born into wealth, but had clawed his way to the top, and now he was used to the privileges of wealth. He believed that respect was something earned through power and money. Anyone who didn't fit into his narrow worldview was irrelevant to him. It was a routine business trip, and Connor boarded the plane to New York with his mind already occupied by the meeting he had the next day. He didn't even notice the elderly woman as she entered the first-class cabin. Her hands trembled slightly as she tried to lift her handbag into the overhead compartment. She was dressed in simple, comfortable clothing, with white hair pinned neatly back and eyes that showed the wisdom of her years. To Connor, she was invisible until her fumbling drew his attention. "Are you going to take all day?" Connor snapped, loud enough for the other passengers to hear. "Some of us have places to be." The woman's face flushed, and she muttered an apology, still struggling with her bag. A flight attendant rushed over to assist, but Connor wasn't finished. He rolled his eyes dramatically and said, "This is first class, lady. If you can't handle it, maybe you should fly coach." The cabin was silent, passengers uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. The elderly woman, now seated and avoiding eye contact, remained quiet for the rest of the flight, her dignity shattered. Connor felt a fleeting sense of satisfaction, but it was quickly replaced by indifference as he returned to his business emails. As the plane landed, Connor quickly gathered his belongings and strode out of the airport, ready for his meeting the next day. The old woman was a distant memory, just another obstacle removed from his path. He had no idea that their paths were about to cross again. Connor's arrogance was not new. In his youth, he had been driven by ambition, always striving to be the best. His competitive nature had earned him a reputation in the corporate world, where ruthlessness was often rewarded. But over the years, his success had bred a sense of entitlement. He believed that money and power gave him the right to treat people however he pleased. The next morning, Connor arrived at his office feeling confident. He had been working on a high-stakes merger that would elevate his company to new heights, and today's meeting with the CEO, Mr. Harold Jennings, was crucial. Jennings was a titan in the industry, and Connor had spent months preparing for this moment. If he could win over Jennings, the deal would be sealed, and Connor's position in the company would be secured for years to come. As Connor entered the sleek, modern office building, he passed by his colleagues with the same air of superiority. They respected him, or at least, feared him enough to stay out of his way. He reached the top floor, where Mr. Jennings' office was located, and took a deep breath. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. But when the door to the office opened, Connor froze. Seated across from Mr. Jennings, sipping tea with a serene expression, was the elderly woman from the plane. His heart dropped. How could she be here? Why was she sitting in his boss's office? Mr. Jennings stood up with a warm smile. "Ah, Connor, come in. I'd like you to meet someone very special." He gestured toward the elderly woman, who now looked at Connor with a piercing gaze. "This is my mother, Eleanor Jennings." Connor's blood ran cold. His thoughts scrambled as he pieced together the situation. The woman he had humiliated yesterday, the woman he had ridiculed in front of a plane full of people, was not just any elderly passenger. She was the mother of his CEO. Eleanor Jennings smiled politely, but her eyes held a knowing gleam. "We've already met," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of unspoken words. The tension in the room was palpable. Connor felt sweat beginning to form at the back of his neck. His mind raced as he tried to salvage the situation. He forced a smile, trying to downplay the incident. "Oh, yes, we were on the same flight yesterday," Connor said, his voice betraying a hint of nervousness. Small world. But Eleanor was not interested in small talk. She remained poised, her gaze never leaving his. "Indeed, it is," she replied, her tone calm but cutting. "It's funny how fate brings people together in unexpected ways, don't you think?" Connor glanced at Mr. Jennings, who was watching the exchange with a curious expression. He couldn't tell if Jennings knew what had happened on the plane, but the tension in the air was thick. The conversation continued awkwardly, with Connor fumbling through the details of the merger, but he could feel Eleanor's eyes on him the entire time. Every word felt like a struggle. His usual confidence was shattered, and for the first time in years, Connor felt powerless. The woman he had dismissed so easily just hours before now held the key to his future. Would she tell her son about the way he had treated her? Would this one mistake cost him everything he had worked for? As the meeting came to an end, Eleanor stood up, smoothing her dress. "It was a pleasure to meet you, Connor," she said, her voice laced with a hidden meaning. "I'm sure we'll be seeing more of each other." Connor could only nod, his throat dry. As she left the room, Mr. Jennings turned to him with a smile. My mother has a keen eye for people. She's very protective of the company and always gives me valuable advice about who I should trust. The words hung in the air like a... Over the next few weeks, Connor's anxiety grew. Every interaction with Mr. Jennings felt strained, as though the older man knew more than he was letting on. Connor's performance at work began to suffer. He made mistakes in his reports, stumbled in meetings, and found himself constantly second-guessing his decisions. His once unshakable confidence was crumbling. But the real torment came from the knowledge that Eleanor Jennings was watching. Every time he passed her in the office, her calm, knowing smile unnerved him. She never mentioned the incident on the plane, but Connor could feel the weight of her judgment in every encounter. It was as if she was silently reminding him that his actions had consequences. The pressure finally reached a breaking point during a critical meeting about the merger. Connor was presenting his final proposal to the board, with Mr. Jennings and Eleanor in attendance. His nerves were shot, and halfway through his presentation, he stumbled over his words, his voice faltering. The room was silent as he tried to regain his composure, but the damage was done. Eleanor's eyes met his, and in that moment, Connor realized the truth. This was more than just a test of his professional abilities. This was about his character, the way he treated people, regardless of their status or appearance. And in Eleanor's eyes, he had already failed. After the meeting, Mr. Jennings pulled him aside. Connor, I've been reviewing your work lately, and I have to say, I'm concerned, Jennings said, his tone firm but not unkind. You're slipping. This merger is too important for us to make mistakes. Connor nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. He knew what was coming. I've decided to bring someone else in to oversee the final stages of the deal, Jennings continued. I think it's best if you step back for now. It was a blow. Connor spent the next few days in a haze of frustration and regret. He had always prided himself on being in control, but now his life was spiraling out of his grasp. He avoided Eleanor whenever he could, unable to face the quiet judgment in her eyes. One evening, after staying late at the office, Connor found himself alone in the break room. As he poured himself a cup of coffee, he heard the soft click of heels behind him. He turned to see Eleanor standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. I think we need to talk, she said quietly. Connor nodded, feeling a knot form in his stomach. He knew this conversation was inevitable. They sat down at a small table, the silence between them heavy. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Eleanor broke the silence. You know, Connor, I've been watching you, she said, her voice gentle but firm. Not just here at work, but on that plane. The way you treated me, it wasn't just disrespectful. It was cruel. Connor's heart sank. He opened his mouth to apologize, but Eleanor held up a hand to stop him. I'm not looking for an apology, she said. I've lived long enough to know that words are cheap. What I want to know is if you've learned anything from this experience. Do you understand why what you did was wrong? Connor stared at her, the weight of her question pressing down on him. For the first time in his life, he was forced to confront the truth about himself. He had spent years building walls around his heart, convinced that success and power were the only things that mattered. But now, sitting across from this woman, he realized how hollow his victories had been. In the weeks that followed, Connor began to make real changes in his life. He started small, taking the time to acknowledge and appreciate the people around him, from his colleagues to the cleaning staff. He learned to listen, to show empathy, and to admit when he was wrong. It wasn't easy, and there were days when he slipped back into old habits, but Eleanor's words echoed in his mind, pushing him to keep going. Eventually, word of Connor's transformation began to spread throughout the office. People noticed the difference in him, the way he treated others with kindness and respect. Even Mr. Jennings seemed to warm up to him again, though he remained cautious. One day,